Good. Welcome, everyone. This is our second Silk Road talk. This is a joint venture between the Berlin Contemporary China Network and the D-Link Relink Research Consortium. So this is a project that's co-led by my colleague Claudia Dericht and Andreas Eckert, both of whom are in this building here. Claudia, should we come up and of course.
Just you.
Wonderful, yes. So this is our new exciting project. This is the second of these talks, and the first talk took place just about 2 weeks ago, and is a very nice introduction to our discussion today. It was looking at how the US is really a non-player in this infrastructure competition between that we see unrolling. So we talked a lot about looking forward to your talk today, Professor Katada. So let me introduce our esteemed speaker today. This is Saori Katada. She's a professor of international relations at the University of Southern California in sunny Los Angeles, where people are probably still suntanning, much unlike us here in our first cover of snow. And she's currently based in Paris as a Banque de France Fondation France-Japan fellow, excuse my terrible French, and she's there for another couple months, and this was a great opportunity for us to bring her up to Berlin to talk about her current research. Saori has extremely wide-ranging research interests spanning North-South relations, Japanese foreign policy, international political economy, regionalism, Pacific Rim, international financial and monetary relations, and foreign aid. Her most recent book, I can tell you that since 2018 she's written or co-authored a total of 3 books. Extremely impressive. I don't know how she does it. I think she doesn't sleep. The most recent book is on Japan's new regional reality, geoeconomic strategy in the Asia-Pacific. That's out with Columbia University Press, and the Japanese version is already out. And previously she published a book on the BRICS and collective financial statecraft, co-authored with Oxford University Press 2017, and another book on taming Japan's deflation, the debate over unconventional monetary policy, also with Cornell University Press. In addition to that, she's got leading articles in prestigious journals from all over the place.
Special for.
Yeah, we had the honor and pleasure of co-editing a special issue in New Political Economy, looking at transnational developmentalism in and through China, which was a great highlight of my small career so far. In addition to all of her academic accolades and credentials, Saori has lots of experience accumulated in the policy world before coming to academia, before joining USC. I didn't know this, actually. She served as a researcher at the World Bank in DC, and she was also an international program officer at the UNDP in Mexico City. And her talk today is looking at between big push, quantity, and bankability, quality, the geoeconomic infrastructure financing in the Indo-Pacific. And we're delighted to have Saori here. Please join me in welcoming.
Yeah, I can only second Sarah and give a very warm welcome to you, Professor Katada, for joining us today. I think you are the perfect link in our D-Link, Relink, and BCCN networking project. We leave out the D, we leave out the Re, you are just the link today between this kind of networking, and very much looking forward to your talk. Last but not least, because we are really lacking such expertise as you bring in. At our institute, I guess we do not have colleagues with this particular expertise. We are in a lack of such input, and I'm really looking forward to your perspectives and what you have to share with us. So many thanks also on behalf of our consortium. Yeah, that's from my side and from the consortium side, of course. Thank you.
Fantastic. So we'll give you the floor.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, thank you for such a generous introduction. You just have to, now your expectation is so high, it's going down here from here, so, trust me on that. Anyway, so, really pleasure to be here. Ich spreche ein bisschen Deutsch, but I heard, but I'm not going to expose myself because I heard, most of the classes are in English here, so I'd like to go ahead and speak in English, which is actually not my native language either, so hopefully you understand. Anyway, so I thank Sarah first of all for inviting me, and really pleasure to be here. we had collaboration for 3 years, I guess. I saw you before you came here in Göttingen, so that's been quite a while, and now it's really nice to come here in person. So my topic, I've been looking at kind of geoeconomics of infrastructure financing. So, obviously with China, with Belt-and-Road Initiative, there is kind of a lot of talk about the competition. So China is pushing this kind of envelope and really becoming a significant dominant presence in the world, especially in the global south, and others are trying to compete with China. But in some ways, here I am talking more about limits as to how much. And maybe the reason why that kind of geoeconomic competition is now focusing only one side of that picture and forgetting the other side, which is kind of a financial side, which I'll get to in a minute. So, in some ways, yes, it's a geoeconomics, again, the geoeconomics, the use of economic instruments for national purposes, but, sometimes it's not that easy to implement geoeconomics given the certain kind of economic conditions that many of the advanced or more resource-rich Western nations kind of reside in. So today's topic is focusing on this kind of issues of infrastructure investment. You probably heard of this Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail. There was a competition going on between Japan and China back in the mid-2010s, where Japan was already kind of working with the Indonesian government to have this high-speed rail built from Jakarta to Bandung. While China came and kind of swept it from the hand of the Japanese in 2015. Really a very big shock to the Japanese. And obviously the Indonesians had their own reasons as to why they went with China. But after 8 years of that bidding, so now almost 8 years of that bidding, this will be to complete in June of 2023. So next year it will open with 142 kilometers from Bandung to Jakarta to Bandung, which would shrink the time of travel from 3 hours to about 50 minutes. So this is kind of a big project. The cost run was, but China promises $5.5 billion. Currently, it has already cost 7.2. So this is, again, significant kind of investment on the part of the consortium between China and Indonesia. And there has been significant delays. Finally, it's being kind of actually coming into place. So maybe they're not as worried. But for a while now, they were not sure if it's going to take off. They had imminent domain problems, so on and so forth. And even now, many worry that the station in Bandung is not actually in downtown Bandung, but it's about 45 minutes away. So how many people will ride this? How much they're going to pay for it? All that is still questionable. So the reason why I kind of put this on the table is not to say that, well, China's project is horrible. That's not my point. But these infrastructure projects are difficult. It will take a lot of time. It will be significantly costly, and it will be the kind of a high risk kind of undertaking. Partly because of that, partly because of the growing population and everything else. They're estimated to be $94 trillion, and some estimate, there are many estimates out there, but one of the estimates is $94 trillion of infrastructure investment needs out there around the world. And obviously much more so in the global south, or developing world, but the stake is much higher, or the risk is much higher in this developing world, because not only the the inherent risk of infrastructure, even that happens in the US or Japan or Germany for that matter, but it's the kind of governance issues, the technical capacity, lack of investment capital, and so on and so forth. So altogether, and moving forward, there are more questions about environmental sustainability and social sustainability, as well as the debt sustainability, which is now becoming really a big question after COVID and many of the debt crisis going on around the global south. So that's that's kind of the question that I am tackling, because there are still a significant interest in infrastructure out there, right? So obviously, Belt-and-Road Initiative, since most of you are in Sarah's class or Sarah's colleagues, I'm sure you have heard of this, I'm sure you have kind of gotten the backdrop of it. But, from 2013, China started this, China kind of merged everything that was going on to create this BRI. And so that was and along with it, China proposed and made it reality the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So this was kind of a breakthrough moment, even though China was already kind of going outside, many of the initiatives are ongoing, but it kind of converged into a real, kind of tangible and major push of the infrastructure kind of moving forward. Meanwhile, there are response or the kind of associated movement on the part of, we call it OECD countries. Now, advanced countries are now kind of a politically incorrect term, so I keep using that, but I guess it's more the OECD countries like Japan, United States, and European countries are also focusing on infrastructure. So Japan, in response to China, or at least sounded like a response to China, proposed a partnership for quality infrastructure. This came in 2015 under Prime Minister Abe, where they promised $200 billion. It was smaller before, but then it got expanded to $200 billion for infrastructure with Japan and in collaboration with the Asian Development Bank. There's other initiative coming from the West. Blue Dot Network, you might have heard, is the United States proposal followed up and then collaborated by Australians and Japanese. This is kind of still ongoing, kind of being formulated, but this is a certification in kind of effort to focus on the quality, so put the seal of approval on the quality infrastructure. So this is an effort now OECD is working on what does it mean to certify, what does it mean to have quality infrastructure. And obviously, just a while ago, G7, they have kind of doled out this partnership for global infrastructure and investment, obviously led by the United States with its follow-up. The last year before, they called it B3W, Build Back Better World, but which didn't really make sense in terms of English, so they renamed it as a kind of better sounding initiative with, again, $600 billion promised for infrastructure investment, but they call it mobilizing $600 billion, and I will get to that in a minute. Obviously the Europeans have the global gateway with significant promise of funding. So altogether, these are, since 2010s, but especially since 2013, there has been many efforts, so it's only the last 10 years. Obviously there are also the effort on the part of sustainable development goals of the United Nations, which also includes infrastructure. So this is the 2015 into 2030, so that's the 15-year kind of goal. So altogether, there's an infrastructure kind of boom out there, or at least a lot of the leaders talk about it as though this is really a kind of top priority for many of those countries. Obviously, infrastructure is important, right? So many of the kind of theories out there talking about how infrastructure can lead to growth, lead to development. These are kind of fundamental things, and again, I'm sure if you hear infrastructure, what I mean was roads and bridges, dams, the airports, and the electric power plants and generation, and the distribution lines, water, and many of those things. These are fundamental for economic growth. These are very important for inviting investment. They are a way to kind of connect your production to the outside world, the ports and everything else. And also this is a kind of basis for many people's welfare, electricity, water, sewage system, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of discussion as to how these are very important part of the big push growth for many of the developing countries. But obviously, the resources limited, especially for the global south, technology, technical capability and all that is limited for the global south. So it had to rely on the outside kind of involvement, both financially and technically, and so on and so forth. when it comes to the involvement of outside the world, there has been kind of an ebbs and flow of this infrastructure finance, but especially for the last 30 years, there has been a decline of it. Well, 30 years before 2010, I should say, there has been a kind of gradual decline. Obviously, the World Bank came to be as a reconstruction entity, which was first meant to be for the Japanese and the Europeans whose whose economies and infrastructure devastated. That World Bank financed Japanese high-speed rail. Shinkansen. You probably know the bullet train was one of the first first loans that World Bank extended. Japan. It took 40 years for Japan to pay everything back. They started borrowing it from 1950, and 1990 finally Japan managed to pay back. But anyway, so one point here is that, as you can see, that there has been a gradual decline of such funding, especially from the 1980s into kind of around 2000. And kind of you can see 2000 around then it kind of hit the bottom. Many reasons. Part of it is that some of these infrastructure are not, again, very hard to do, but not well done. Sometimes these things lead to corruption and collusion on the part of many of the countries that are receiving these infrastructure investment. More, kind of, maybe, kind of reading the political line of it is that these used to be, and then obviously World Bank, mostly are the Bretton Woods institutions supported by many of the advanced nations, and there used to be a good investment on the part of their supporting government, like the US and European countries, for their own industries, because they are the ones building roads and all that. But after a while, not so much. Now it's a Chinese company, the Indian company, the Korean companies, which come in to kind of take these bids because these are open bids. And so this is not supported by the industries of these advanced nations. And so now the focus of the World Bank and many of these multilateral development banks are shifted to poverty reduction, institution capacity, governance, all sustainability. Some of them definitely have some infrastructure tangents, but kind of shifted away from actual physical infrastructure, again, until mid-2010. Now, so from 2010 to now, so why is it? Why now? Why in the last 10 plus years where there has been so much interest? And as I said, it's obviously China's influence, is it? Right? Geoeconomic competition, where many of the Europeans are kind of looking at Africa and say, oh, they're not interested in us anymore. If they have China, France or Germany or all that, no longer is the kind of the donors of the development that they were supporting for a long time. So all that is definitely made probably part of the picture, but as important as the geoeconomic or geostrategic competition, I would argue, is the economic foundation of these capital-rich Western nations, and the need for infrastructure as a way, kind of a way, as a means, as a target of their investment, and that's my argument. So I'll go through a few things from here on. I would first like to talk about the theory, and kind of many people who been looking at this, I'm not the only one, as to the kind of financialization and the kind of the connection to development. And then talk about why China can do this while many advanced nations of the West struggles with it. So the kind of China's success, and at least until now, I'm not saying it's going to last forever, but until now, how they managed to finance infrastructure on one side, and then talk about mostly Japan. That's kind of where my expertise lies. So talking about Japan, of what Japan used to do in the past, which was actually basis of what China is doing now, and then how it changed and what it's doing in order to kind of compensate for that kind of transformation, as Japan is also facing this financialization equal development. So that's the kind of outline. So theoretically speaking, I think it's a very interesting kind of phenomena going on in terms of financialization development nexus going around. So financialization, you probably heard, I think financialization is much more common in the social science in Europe than the United States. It's kind of rare to talk about financialization in the US, but Europe, it's everywhere, so I assume you know. But basically, the wealth is built not through production, but through wealth. So investing in stock market and equity and many types of investment create more wealth. So wealth effect and all that is financialization. And obviously I didn't check the data, but if you look at the basis of growth, the financial part of the growth has exponentially developed, kind of expanded in 1990s forward. So that's the kind of really lopsided where production is not much of a wealth building. And measures, while now financialization is kind of a significant one. Meanwhile, I would say that global financial crisis, and again, I realize that's a more American way of calling it. What do you call it? Financial crisis, a global recession?
That's also mine. That's also the academic springs to mind for me. Yeah. Okay.
Global financial crisis of 2008, 2009 really is a timing benchmark. So not BRI necessarily, but a bit earlier than that, where there used to be a place where a lot of money went, right? The mortgage-backed security, all the collateral, kind of the derivatives and so on and so forth, that dissipated quite rapidly at the time of that crisis. And obviously that led to the portfolio capital glut, where there was significant money that was pursuing some return, they couldn't find it, and so in some ways that kind of that created kind of an important backdrop of the financialization leading to development. So where about during the same kind of at the same time, there are some very smart asset managers out there in the world looking at infrastructure and kind of things like pension fund, mutual fund, all those things being kind of well connected, could be well connected, not connected yet, but could be a good match. Because these pension funds are long-term in nature, and infrastructure demand is so high everywhere, matching it and make infrastructure as a kind of an asset class. So it's one asset to invest in would be a good idea. So there are some scholars who looked at this as a way for some of these kind of asset managers to say, okay, infrastructure would be a good place to kind of invest your money. Thus come this kind of connection to the development from the financialization and development, and Maldusky call it the connection, the kind of a financialization development nexus, financialization of development in many ways. So that's kind of the backdrop of, especially from the global financial crisis, the time of global financial crisis, where financialization is connected to the need of financing in development, especially in infrastructure, as I noted earlier, that has been a very high demand. Meanwhile, what's needed, obviously, is for the state is the role of de-risking infrastructure investment. As I said earlier, these investments are risky inherently in nature, and there has to be some way of making sure these investments can be how do you call it? Kind of desirable thing for private investors, that kind of mutual fund people or private banks and so on to engage in. So that's that became the role of the state to de-risk. And in that sense, the focus on quality, or maybe bankability, so investability, became crucial part of what the OECD governments need to do in order to promote this in the face of the China's BRI challenge. So that's the kind of logic, and this is my feeble way of kind of visualizing it. I'm not very good at it. My graduate student can do it like 10 times better, but I thought maybe visualization will be helpful. So, global financial crisis actually led to China's outward expansion too. I mean, they were doing going out strategy before GFC, but that whole excess capacity of the significant stimulus package and all that actually put much more kind of weight forward for the BRI. So that's definitely a cause. Meanwhile, obviously, as I said, the GFC created this infrastructure and asset class because that's one of the places that the kind of capital portfolio glut could go. While having kind of a competitive pressure from China, as well as kind of a pressure from making this investable possibility, the de-risking role of the state is now leading to the quality or bankability of the infrastructure investment. So that's the kind of general logic. So having said that, so that's kind of a framework of my thinking. And the question is also how it's actually done on the ground. How does China do it? China is obviously investing massively. So far, 1.3 trillion, but kind of sometimes they say, oh, maybe they're aiming for $8 trillion and so on and so forth. How can China do this? How is it done? Kind of a finance infrastructure in countries like Sudan, Ethiopia, where some of that kind of a challenge is really large. So these are mostly work of others, not mine, but China's government, Chinese authorities, de-risking advantages are quite a few. So one of the de-risking strategies, so you probably know this is Min-Yon Chen's work on this is really good. So if you want to work on this, I will send you the citation. But so one, obviously the two large infrastructure financiers from China are the Import-Export Bank of China and the China Development Bank. So both of them combined, both of them would be as large as all the policy banks of the OECD countries combined. And so it's massive and huge and so on. They actually float their bonds and procure their financing from the market. But market not meaning the individual investors, but these are the banks. The Chinese, many of them state-owned banks, are kind of buying bonds, and that's the source of their funding. So basically, the market logic should apply. Meanwhile, the government support is large. So if there's any shortfall, government infuses quite frequently the funding into these banks. So in some ways, there is already kind of a government backing there. Easy way to de-risk. The other one is that they sometimes lend directly to sovereign or sub-sovereigns with significant guarantee being in place. Sometimes they waive it, but most of the time they have the guarantee from these authorities. Or they actually not go, the money doesn't go across the border. They fund their investment, their infrastructure within China, where Chinese companies get paid, so that they can go to African countries to build roads and bridges and so on and so forth. So in some ways, the risk is minimized there. China also kind of have the high interest rate. So Chinese infrastructure investment are not foreign aid. Obviously China is not OECD member, so they don't have to abide by what constitutes aid and so on. But if you apply that rule to Chinese investment in infrastructure, only about 10% qualify for aid. The rest is basically the commercial basis. So usually they apply relatively high interest rate. 3 to 6% is the usual rate, where OECD kind of says it has to be grand or very, very concessional rate, and that's not the case for China. So return should be pretty large. And then they have kind of an escrow account that they, maybe the fourth point. So they actually have other ways to get money back. Very common use and very criticized use of it is the commodity-backed or resource-secured financing, where they would say, okay, so Ecuador, very typical case, where you benchmark half of your oil income to pay back this this port or this kind of oil refinery or something of that nature. So that way they have already a future guarantee of a repayment. They also have these kind of escrow account that they have to, the government asks, the recipient government asks to set up, where some cash are already reserved for this and then things like that. I hear in terms of the resource secured finance, about half of Chinese projects are done that way. So, and also China has a very large Sinisho, which is the insurance company that basically kind of support and then guarantee some of that. By the way, Horn, Reinhardt, and Tvedt Bish, I guess he's a guy from Germany, Kiel Institute. They have, this was from 2019 publication, but now their publication of 2021 called Hidden Default from the World Bank, as a World Bank research paper, has been cited quite a bit about these practices and kind of some data analysis and things like that. So that's how China does it. While Japan used to do similar. You might heard or you might know that Japan has been the largest foreign aid donor throughout the 1980s to China, and even quite significant kind of partner giving foreign aid to China into the 1990s. They started phasing it out from 95 and then basically stopped by 28 at the time of the Olympics, and now it's all gone because China is no longer a foreign aid deserving nation, I guess. But partly because of that, and partly because of the significant success that Japan has had with Southeast Asian nations from the 1950s into 1980s, when it comes to infrastructure financing, China kind of had some of that ideas coming from Japan. So Japan used to use a lot of tied aid. So Japan joined OECD, so their hands are tied from early on. And there has been a lot of criticism against Japan forever from the 1960s to 1990s because Japan was the major aid donor but still not behaving in the same way as many other aid donors are behaving, where Japan had a lot of tied aid. So, I don't know if you can see it clearly, but when you say like in 1979, tied aids constitute more than half of what Japan gave. Tied aid is the aid where when Japan gives aid to Indonesia, you said you have to purchase it from all the items from Japan, right? So that's tied aid. And the other red one is that kind of developing country tied. So it's either the receiving country or Japan can procure what's being needed, things like that. And OECD hated it, put pressure on it. There was a lot of policy decision coming out, but Helsinki Accord in 2001, basically kind of do away with these tied aid because it tends to kind of increase the cost of these projects and so on and so forth. So Japan, as again OECD member, got pressure to reduce it quite significantly. So if you see in the middle part, and sorry it's a bit small for you to see, but it has decreased quite significantly from the early 1990s into kind of mid-20s. And then it kind of started to climb back up a little bit more, but not as much as it used to. So that's the kind of OECD norm putting pressure on Japan to change its behavior. So Japan used to be what kind of China could do, but not really doing that anymore. So again, the kind of transition of Japan being the infrastructure finance, kind of large financier, and having more problem or less of the impact is one of it. Is that. The other one is obviously Japan being becoming more advanced, more in many ways more pricey in terms of getting these infrastructure investment, infrastructure kind of project done. So price has gone up significantly, obviously with the quality, but these are the things that many of the developing countries cannot afford. So when it comes to infrastructure export, and that was the reason I remember talk to you about World Bank started to kind of phase out or decline, kind of reduce significant part of the infrastructure, is that Japanese infrastructure export declined or stayed flat from 2005 to 2011, while Korea, again, less expensive, kind of with the quality and so on, tripled its amount in Asia, and then China became 7 times as much in this matter of 6 years. So all that kind of comes to show that Japan had become very lacking price competitiveness vis-a-vis other producers, other possible kind of the companies which can procure many of these infrastructure investment. Even in the Asian Development Bank, which is the bank that Japan actually helped establish, or maybe led establishing in 1966, which was again focusing a lot more on the infrastructure. Japan's bid was only 0.5% of their overall infrastructure projects, which actually, kind of shows that actually, naturally, price-wise and so on, Japan has kind of had to, really kind of do something about it, otherwise it will kind of keep losing. Also, the kind of the change in Japan's infrastructure finance is not about Japan, but about the rest of the world, where some of the funding modalities changed. It used to be that it was easy to manage, especially regarding the Southeast Asian nation, governments, where government will guarantee, and Japan's government also, and the recipient government guarantee, and then kind of supported the kind of a private investment to go in to build a dam or airport and so on and so forth. But now the privatization is coming to the recipient side too. So they have to actually manage many of the different players, and that increased the risk. So Japanese companies were much more hesitant to engage in this. So again, given the push from the financial side and the Chinese competition, both kind of pushing pressure on Japan, they have worked to kind of pursue this bankability issue. According to the Japanese JBIC, Japan Bank for International Cooperation, that's the policy bank that basically funds many of these, infrastructure. But again, not on its own, but they're trying to get a lot of private funding come in. Is that openness, transparency, economic viability, debt sustainability, and compliance, with the law and regulation are the critical component of, kind of the infrastructure being high quality or bankable. So what they've been trying to do, and I wouldn't say it's been that big of a success, but the aim of it is to entice as much private finance as possible. So you probably heard of PPP, the public-private partnership. So various ways that the Japanese government is trying to entice private partners to come, especially in terms of funding. So JBIC becomes kind of pipe primer, I guess, the priming the pipe of trying to induce private finance to come. So one way, especially after the Abe's announcement of the quality, Prime Minister Abe's announcement of the quality infrastructure, partnership for quality infrastructure investment, that they have gone into a significant reform where many of the high risk tolerance can be, so JBIC can tolerate more risk, so that they can kind of put some money into some project that that they would like to make sure that the private ones come in. So they created special account where they can take kind of more risk in terms of kind of assessment-wise, they can kind of tolerate more risk. They had, instead of evaluating project by project, they kind of put together some of the project together so that they can actually balance the risk against each other. Their repayment terms are made a bit easier in terms of what kind of investment and so on. They are now partnering with the local government, so that's a different kind of, maybe Japan learning from China this time, where it's not only the national government, the local government can partner with Japan. And JBIC is actually now starting to participate not only in terms of loans but in terms of equity, so they can have stake in that project. So these are the kind of examples of how JBIC is trying to change a bit the platform, so that it itself can take more risks and also invite the private investment to come. So, and also kind of various other ways of making sure that bankability is guaranteed. One of the things really that I've been interviewing many JBIC officials, one of the things that they emphasized is that these infrastructures have to pay itself quite, kind of, and that should be forecasted into the future. That's really important part of these investment. So one of the examples that they actually like to do, which is easier for them to manage, is the electricity generation. Because you can, by looking at the city, if you create electricity generating plant, you can kind of forecast forward how much fee to cover, how many people will be paying, all that. So that by benchmarking it and making that as the kind of platform for repayment, they can actually project forward relatively easily. So that kind of repayment capacity is, kind of assessment is becoming really important part of those projects. And high-speed rail being kind of in between, it's not as easy to estimate how much of that return would be, foreseen by the investors. But these are the kind of ways in which they are focusing on the bankability. While obviously market discipline applies and private sector has to be involved because the public finance is not nearly enough for that type of investment, and also the compliance and law and regulation are important. So here, this is not necessarily the funding part, but Japanese government is also involved in many of the Southeast Asian nations where they can have the capacity, the legal capacity for kind of a protection of property rights, and also the free trade agreement, all those things which are creating some regulations of kind of respecting investment and so on has become an important part of it. So to wrap up, I think, did I go too far? Yeah, maybe a little bit. But to conclude an implication. So obviously China's competition, but not necessarily the amount, well, not necessarily the amount of it, but maybe that's related, but in being able to de-risk these infrastructure investment is really a kind of a critical part of that competition. And OECD countries are now struggling and trying hard to match up with them. I think if you are really working on development, you're saying, where is the beef? There's a lot of talk. And they say they would mobilize $600 billion and this and that. But how much is really going to pan out is still somewhat, still significantly questionable. Meanwhile, even on the China side, I don't know how, there is a big question as to how long this could continue. Again, the Xi Jinping's speech in the People's Congress. Didn't mention China, the BRI like once or twice instead of like 5 or 15 times in the past and stuff like that. So they are looking at BRI kind of somewhat differently and not highlighting it as much. I hear from actually 2019, China's investment in development is now creating a negative flow, meaning they are getting some back, but not as much, into it, into investment. And also, obviously, China's rescheduling like crazy of all the things that they've been extending into really difficult places like Republic of Congo, Zambia, so on and so forth. So how much can this, de-risking and all that, the debt sustainability can China itself, so it's not the debt sustainability, but loan sustainability, the investment sustainability can it tolerate is a big question. So Japan has been, again, engaging in this de-risking process. How much of the impact is still questionable. Still, the private funding is not as much, and it hasn't really, kind of come up to competitive speed. Japan does have an advantage of having significant track record and accumulated infrastructure investment. If you compare China and Japan, I think this year's Japan is still a larger infrastructure investment in Southeast Asia in cumulative terms. But again, it will be taken over by China pretty soon. So, and new funding is still not very easy to implement. Obviously, implication of COVID, kind of borrowing countries and the debt sustainability is now becoming kind of an important question. Many of the countries, many of the creditor countries, the OECD ones and so on, now are trying to go to Paris Club to not only reschedule but forgive some of the debt. No, definitely China is not well, China. So there's totally another talk about China's, always a Paris Club and debt rescheduling politics. But still, it's really a big question at this point. Meanwhile, having said all that, coming back to the first point, it's quite amazing. Even at G20 this time in Indonesia, infrastructure is all over the place. Biden talked about it, her name, the EU commissioner talked about it. It's still everywhere. They focus on the environment and digital, which are both places where sustainability can, both the industries of advanced nations have the most advantage. So obviously these are the kind of quality that they would like to pursue. But now most of the global south have borrowed significantly from China. Now they are suffering from significant debt sustainability issues, but they are still talking to the OECD leaders, the United States, Europeans, are still talking about it. So that kind of make me feel that, yes, the financialization and the kind of financialization development nexus is still kind of alive and kicking, and now when the stock market is going down in the United States and so on and so forth, there is heightened pressure to see if there is anything that can be done about infrastructure as an asset class. So I'll stop here. And I have an advertisement of my book.